What if a single moment of kindness could change not just one life, but thousands? What if a simple human gesture, lasting no more than seconds, could transform a person from the brink of despair into someone who would reshape the world around them? This isn't a fairy tale. This isn't Hollywood fiction. This is the true story of Marcus Chun, a tech billionaire who built an empire worth over $8 billion, and Sarah Mitchell, a struggling nurse whose one act of compassion saved more than just a life that cold December night in 2019. But here's what nobody expected. The kiss that saved Marcus wasn't romantic. It wasn't passionate. It was something far more powerful than love. It was hope delivered by a complete stranger who had every reason to walk away, but chose to stay instead. What happened next would challenge everything you think you know about success, failure, and the invisible threads that connect us all. Because sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the most ordinary people in the most unexpected places at the exact moment when giving up seems like the only option left. The ripple effects of that December night are still being felt today, touching lives across continents and industries in ways that seemed impossible just a few years ago. And it all started with a woman who was working her third consecutive double shift, a man who had lost everything that mattered to him, and a bridge that has witnessed both endings and beginnings for over a century. This is their story. This is how one kiss saved a billionaire, and how that billionaire's response created something nobody saw coming. Marcus Chun stood on the Golden Gate Bridge at 2:47 a.m. on December 15th, 2019, with nothing left to lose. The man who had once graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune, who had delivered TED Talks to standing ovations, and whose innovative software had revolutionized how hospitals manage patient care globally, was now just another broken soul contemplating the end. The wind whipped through his expensive coat, the same Armani jacket he'd worn to ring the opening bell at NASDAQ 3 years earlier when Medicore Solutions had gone public. That day, he'd been worth $2.3 billion on paper. Tonight, he couldn't afford a decent meal. The fall had been spectacular and swift. It started with what seemed like a minor software glitch in Medicore's flagship product, HealthSync Pro, which managed patient records for over 4,000 hospitals across North America. The glitch had caused medication dosages to display incorrectly for nearly 6 hours before being detected. During those 6 hours, 17 patients received incorrect medications. 3 died. The lawsuits came first, wave after wave of them. Families seeking justice, hospitals demanding compensation, insurance companies refusing coverage. Then came the government investigations. The FDA suspended Medicore's operations pending a full review. The SEC launched their own probe into whether Marcus had known about potential system vulnerabilities before the IPO. But the real devastation was personal. Marcus had poured everything into Medicore, not just his own money, but funds from friends, family, and early believers. His parents had mortgaged their San Francisco home to invest $200,000 in the early rounds. His younger sister Lisa had withdrawn her entire teacher's pension fund, convinced that her brother's genius would secure her retirement. His best friend from Stanford, David Kim, had left a lucrative position at Google to become Medicore's chief technology officer, bringing along a dozen talented engineers who trusted his judgment. When Medicore collapsed, it took all of them down too. The media, once eager to celebrate the young Chinese-American entrepreneur who'd built a billion-dollar company by age 32, now painted him as either incompetent or criminal. Headlines screamed about reckless billionaires and tech bros who play with lives. The narrative was simple and damaging. Marcus Chun had prioritized profits over patient safety, cutting corners to rush his product to market. The truth was more complex, but no less devastating. Marcus had indeed known about potential vulnerabilities in the system. His engineering team had identified them during beta testing and recommended an additional 3 months of development to address them. But Medicore was burning through $2 million monthly in operational costs. Investors were growing impatient. Hospitals were demanding the solution they'd been promised. The pressure to launch was immense. Marcus made the decision that would haunt him forever. He authorized the release, believing his team could patch the vulnerabilities with regular updates once revenue started flowing. It was a calculated risk that went catastrophically wrong. The criminal charges came 11 months later. The district attorney, facing pressure from victims' families and media attention, filed charges of involuntary manslaughter and criminal negligence. Marcus's lawyers were confident they could beat the charges, but the legal fees were astronomical. His assets had already been frozen in civil litigation. The house in Pacific Heights was gone, sold to pay creditors. The Tesla, the artwork, the investment portfolio, everything liquidated to cover mounting legal bills. His personal relationships crumbled as quickly as his business empire. His fiancée, Rebecca Santos, a successful marketing executive he'd met at a tech conference, ended their engagement via text message after the charges were filed. She couldn't handle the media scrutiny, she said. Her career was suffering from the association. Marcus understood, but it didn't make the abandonment hurt less. His parents stopped taking his calls after they lost their home. The shame was too much for his traditional Chinese father, who had bragged about his successful son to anyone who would listen. Now Marcus Chun was a source of family disgrace, a name whispered about at community gatherings. Lisa was the cruelest cut of all. She'd been more than a sister. She'd been his closest friend and biggest supporter since childhood. When the teacher's pension fund came after her for the money she'd invested and lost, she'd had to declare bankruptcy. Her teaching career was over. She blamed Marcus for destroying her life and told him never to contact her again. David Kim's story was perhaps the most tragic. The brilliant engineer had used his Google stock options and his family's savings to invest in Medicore. When the company failed, he'd lost everything. His wife left him, taking their 2 young children to her parents' house in Portland. David spiraled into depression and alcoholism, ending up homeless on the streets of San Jose. Marcus had tried to help, but David refused all contact, viewing Marcus as the architect of his destruction. The dozen engineers who'd followed David to Medicore were blacklisted throughout Silicon Valley. The Medicore scandal had tainted everyone associated with it. These were brilliant minds who'd sacrificed promising careers to join Marcus's vision, and now they couldn't find work anywhere in the tech industry. By December 2019, Marcus was staying in a $40 per night motel in Oakland, paying cash for weekly rates. His legal team had abandoned him when the retainer ran dry. The public defender assigned to his case was overwhelmed and had met with Marcus exactly twice in 3 months. The trial was scheduled for February, and conviction seemed inevitable. The isolation was complete. Marcus hadn't had a meaningful conversation with another human being in weeks. He spent his days walking the city, avoiding areas where he might be recognized, eating cheap meals from convenience stores. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by nightmares about the patients who died and the people whose lives he'd destroyed. The irony wasn't lost on him. Medicore's mission had been to save lives by making medical information more accessible and accurate. Instead, his life's work had killed people and destroyed families. The software that was supposed to be his legacy had become his curse. On the night of December 15th, Marcus had reached his breaking point. He'd spent the day walking through Golden Gate Park, remembering better times when he'd jogged these paths as a Stanford student, dreaming of changing the world. The contrast between those dreams and his current reality was unbearable. He'd written letters that afternoon, one to his parents, apologizing for the shame he'd brought to their family, one to Lisa, begging her forgiveness and explaining that his life insurance policy would help her rebuild, one to Rebecca, wishing her happiness and success, one to David, accepting full responsibility for his friend's suffering and asking him to find a way forward. The letters were back in his motel room, along with his will, which left his few remaining possessions to a victim advocacy fund he'd researched online. He'd planned everything carefully, the same methodical approach he'd once applied to building software systems. Walking onto the Golden Gate Bridge at 2 a.m., Marcus felt a strange sense of peace. The decision was made. The suffering would end. The people he'd hurt would no longer have to see his face in the news or deal with reminders of their loss. It seemed like the cleanest solution to an impossibly messy situation. The bridge was nearly empty at this hour, just the occasional car crossing between San Francisco and Marin County. Marcus walked to the midpoint, looking out at the dark waters of San Francisco Bay far below. He'd read that the fall took about 4 seconds, and that most people lost consciousness from fear before impact. It seemed quick and certain. He climbed over the railing, his feet balancing on the narrow ledge on the outside of the bridge. The wind was stronger here, tugging at his clothes and hair. Below, the water looked black and infinite. Above, a few stars struggled through the Bay Area's perpetual haze. Marcus closed his eyes and thought about Medicorp's early days, when everything had seemed possible. He remembered the excitement of those first successful tests, the joy on his team's faces when they landed their first major hospital contract, the pride in his parents' voices when Forbes first profiled him as a rising entrepreneur. He thought about the patients who died and their families, people whose names he'd memorized from court documents. Maria Santos, a grandmother who'd received 10 times the proper dosage of blood thinner. James Wright, a father of 3 who'd been given insulin instead of antibiotics. Patricia Chun, who shared his last name and had died from medication interaction that HealthSync Pro should have flagged but didn't. These thoughts had tormented him for months, but tonight they felt different. Tonight they felt like a final accounting, a last acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused before making the only restitution left available to him. Marcus opened his eyes, looked down at the water one more time, and prepared to let go. In 4 seconds, it would all be over. The shame, the guilt, the isolation, the crushing weight of responsibility for so much suffering. 4 seconds to freedom. He was about to release his grip when he heard footsteps approaching on the bridge walkway behind him. Marcus froze, hoping whoever it was would pass by quickly. He didn't want to be stopped now, not when he'd finally found the courage to end this nightmare. But the footsteps slowed, then stopped directly behind him. "Hey there," a woman's voice said softly. "I'm Sada. What's your name?" Marcus didn't turn around. He couldn't let someone talk him out of this, not now. "Please just keep walking," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm Fina." "You don't look fine," Sarah said, moving closer. "And I'm not going anywhere. So what's your name?" Despite everything, Marcus almost smiled. Even in his final moments, someone was refusing to follow his instructions. "Marcus," he said finally. "My name is Marcus." "Well, Marcus, I'm a nurse at SF General, and I've been walking this bridge for 3 years every night after my shift. I've never seen someone standing where you're standing who was actually fine. So why don't you tell me what's really going on?" Sarah Mitchell had seen enough death in her 8 years as a trauma nurse to recognize when someone was preparing to die. The way Marcus gripped the railing, the deliberate stillness of his posture, the careful positioning of his feet on the narrow ledge. These were the movements of someone who had made a decision and was gathering courage to follow through. She'd been walking the Golden Gate Bridge for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not by choice, but by necessity. Walking was the only thing that helped her process the horrors she witnessed daily in SF General's emergency department. Tonight had been particularly brutal. A 5-car pileup on Highway 101 that brought in 7 casualties, including 2 children. She'd worked for 14 straight hours trying to save an 8-year-old girl who reminded her of her own daughter Emma. They'd lost the child anyway. Most nights, Sarah walked the bridge alone with her thoughts, letting the cold air clear her mind of blood and trauma and the sound of heart monitors flatlining. But tonight was different. Tonight, someone else was using the bridge for a different kind of ending. "Marcus," she said again, keeping her voice steady and calm, the same tone she used with panic patients in the ER. "I can see you're in a lot of pain right now. Whatever's happening in your life, it must feel overwhelming." Marcus finally turned his head slightly, enough for Sarah to see his profile in the dim light from the bridge's towers. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of expensive haircut that suggested he hadn't always been in this position. His clothes were nice, but wrinkled, as if he'd been wearing them for days. "You don't understand," Marcus said, his voice hollow. I've destroyed everything. People died because of me. People I cared about lost everything because they trusted me. There's no coming back from what I've done. Sarah recognized the tone. She'd heard it from patients who'd been in terrible accidents, from parents whose children had been hurt, from anyone carrying the crushing weight of responsibility for others' suffering. Guilt was a poison that could kill just as surely as any trauma. "Tell me about it," she said simply, settling onto the sidewalk behind him with her back against the bridge's railing. She made it clear she wasn't going anywhere. "I'm not leaving, Marcus, so you might as well talk to me. What happened that was so terrible?" For the next hour, Marcus told her everything. About Medicore and the software glitch. About the patients who died and the lawsuits that followed. About his family and friends who'd invested their futures in his company and lost everything when it collapsed. About the criminal charges and the media coverage and the complete destruction of his reputation. Sarah listened without judgment, asking occasional questions to keep him talking. She'd learned that people contemplating suicide often needed to tell their story one more time, to have someone witness their pain and acknowledge the legitimacy of their suffering. Sometimes that was enough to create a small opening, a moment of doubt about the finality they were considering. As Marcus spoke, Sarah began to understand the magnitude of his fall. She'd vaguely remembered news coverage about Medicore's collapse, though she hadn't connected the dots to the man on the bridge. The scale of the destruction was staggering. Not just the deaths that had triggered the crisis, but the ripple effects that had devastated dozens of families and hundreds of employees. "The worst part," Marcus said, his voice breaking, "is that I knew there were problems with the software. My team told me we needed more time, but I pushed for the launch anyway. I convinced myself that we could fix things with updates, that the benefits outweighed the risks. I was wrong, and people died because of my arrogance." "So you made a mistake," Sarah said quietly. "A terrible mistake with tragic consequences, but still a mistake. That doesn't make you a murderer, Marcus. That makes you human." "Human doesn't matter to the families of the people who died," Marcus replied. "Human doesn't matter to David, who's living on the streets because he trusted me. Human doesn't matter to my sister, who lost her pension because she believed in her brother. I was supposed to be smart enough to prevent all of this." Sarah understood the weight of that responsibility. Every day in the ER, she made decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for her patients. The pressure was immense, and the margin for error was razor thin. She'd made mistakes too, though none with consequences as far-reaching as Marcus's. 3 years ago, Sarah said, staring out at the dark water, "I lost a patient because I misread a chart. A 60-year-old man came in with chest pain, and I administered medication that interacted with something he was already taking. He went into cardiac arrest and died 20 minutes later." Marcus turned around completely now, looking at her with surprise. "What happened?" "His family sued the hospital. I was suspended for 2 weeks while they investigated. The medical board reviewed my case and found that while I made an error, it was the kind of mistake that could happen to any experienced nurse working under stress. They didn't revoke my license, but they required additional training and supervision." "But you kept working," Marcus observed. "I thought about quitting," Sarah admitted. "I thought about changing careers completely. The guilt was eating me alive. But then I realized something. If I quit, if I let that mistake define me, then that man died for nothing. The only way to honor his memory was to become a better nurse, to save other lives, to make sure I never made that kind of error again." "That's different," Marcus said. "You made one mistake that killed one person. I made a decision that killed 3 people and destroyed hundreds of lives. The scale isn't comparable. Guilt isn't measured by scale, Marcus. Pain isn't measured by scale. What matters is what you do with it." Sarah stood up, moving closer to the railing where Marcus was perched. "You're right that you can't undo what happened. You can't bring those patients back, or give your investors their money back, or erase the pain you've caused. But you can choose what happens next." "What's left?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. "I'm facing prison time. I have no money, no family, no friends. My reputation is destroyed. Even if I'm acquitted, Who's going to trust me with anything important ever again? What kind of life is that? Sarah thought about her own life, about the challenges that had brought her to these late-night bridge walks. She was a single mother raising Emma after her ex-husband abandoned him when Emma was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. She worked double shifts to pay for Emma's medical expenses while still providing the kind of care her daughter needed. Most days were a struggle, but they were her struggles, and she'd found meaning in them. I don't know what kind of life it is, Sarah said honestly. Maybe it's a life spent making amends. Maybe it's a life dedicated to preventing the kind of tragedy that happened with your software. Maybe it's a life that looks nothing like what you planned, but still has value and purpose. You think I could actually help people after what I've done? Marcus asked. Marcus, you built software that was used by 4,000 hospitals. You understand healthcare technology better than almost anyone. The fact that your software failed doesn't erase your expertise. It probably makes you more valuable, not less. You know exactly what can go wrong and why. For the first time in their conversation, Marcus seemed to consider the possibility that death might not be his only option. Sarah could see him wrestling with the idea, and she pressed her advantage. What if the families of those patients who died could see that your suffering led to changes that prevented other deaths? What if your investors could see that their losses contributed to innovations that save lives? What if your story became a cautionary tale that made other entrepreneurs more careful, more responsible? You think that's possible? Marcus asked. I think anything's possible if you're alive to work toward it, Sarah said. But none of it's possible if you let go of that railing tonight. They stood in silence for several minutes. The only sounds the wind through the bridge's cables and the distant hum of late-night traffic. Sarah could see Marcus thinking, weighing options he'd convinced himself didn't exist. I'm scared, Marcus finally admitted. I'm scared of prison, scared of being broke, scared of being alone. I'm scared that no matter what I do, it won't be enough to make up for the harm I've caused. Fear makes sense, Sarah said. What you're facing is terrifying, but fear and hopelessness aren't the same thing. Fear means you still care about what happens next. Marcus looked down at the water again, then back at Sarah. If I climb back over this railing, what then? I go back to my motel room and wait for my trial? I try to rebuild a life from nothing? How do I even begin? You begin by not dying tonight, Sarah said simply. Everything else, we figure out one day at a time. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then said, You keep saying Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Sarah thought about that question. Why was she willing to invest in a stranger's survival? Maybe it was her nurse's instinct to preserve life. Maybe it was recognition of a fellow human being in pain. Maybe it was her own experience with guilt and redemption. Because 3 years ago, when I was drowning in guilt over my patient's death, a doctor in my hospital sat with me for 2 hours and talked me through it. She didn't have to do that. It wasn't her job. But she recognized that I was in danger of letting one mistake destroy my ability to help people, and she wouldn't let that happen. What did she tell you? She told me that guilt was a luxury I couldn't afford, that wallowing in self-blame might make me feel like I was honoring my patient's memory, but actually it was selfish. The best way to honor him was to become the kind of nurse who would never make that mistake again, and to use my experience to help other nurses avoid it too. Marcus considered this. So guilt is selfish? Paralyzing guilt is selfish. Productive guilt, guilt that motivates you to do better. That's different. That's useful. Sarah moved even closer to the railing. Marcus, I need you to make me a promise before you decide anything else tonight. What kind of promise? Promise me you'll give it one more day. Just 24 hours. Don't make any permanent decisions tonight while you're in this much pain. Go back to wherever you're staying, get some sleep, and promise me you'll still be alive tomorrow night at this time. What happens tomorrow night? Tomorrow night, if you still want to die, you can come back to this bridge and make that choice. But you'll make it with a clear head after a full day to think about what we've talked about. Can you promise me that? Marcus looked at her for a long time, this stranger who'd appeared out of the darkness to bear witness to his pain. You really think there's a way forward? I think there's always a way forward if you're brave enough to look for it. And Marcus, building a billion-dollar company before you were 35 takes courage. Surviving its collapse and facing criminal charges takes courage too. The question is whether you'll use that courage to end your story or to write a new chapter. Slowly, carefully, Marcus began to climb back over the railing. Sarah stayed close, ready to help if he slipped, but she let him do it himself. When his feet touched the bridge walkway, he collapsed onto the concrete, shaking with exhaustion and relief. Sarah sat beside him, not speaking, just providing a steady presence while he processed what had almost happened. After several minutes, Marcus looked up at her. "I don't even know your last name," he said. "Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell, I think you just saved my life." Sarah reached in her pocket and pulled out a small business card. "This has my number at the hospital. I want you to call me tomorrow, just to check in. And I want you to call me the day after that. In fact, I want you to call me every day until you're stable enough that I don't have to worry about you coming back to this bridge." Marcus took the card, holding like a lifeline. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah stood up, brushing dust off her scrubs. "Because sometimes the universe puts you exactly where you need to be to help someone who needs it. And because I believe in second chances, even for people who think they don't deserve them." As they walked back toward the San Francisco side of the bridge together, Sarah did something she'd never done before with a patient or anyone she just met. She stopped walking, turned to Marcus, and kissed him gently on the forehead. The same kind of kiss she gave Emma when her daughter was scared or hurt. "That's for luck," she said simply. "And for courage. You're going to need both." Marcus touched his forehead where she'd kissed him, tears starting to flow for the first time since Medicorp's collapse. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Sarah said. "Thank me in a year when you've figured out what comes next. Thank me when you've found a way to turn this tragedy into something meaningful. Thank me when you've proven that tonight was the beginning of your real story, not the end of it." As Sarah walked away into the pre-dawn darkness, Marcus stood alone on the bridge, no longer contemplating death, but wondering for the first time in months what it might mean to truly live again. The kiss on his forehead felt like a benediction, a blessing from a stranger who'd refused to let him die alone. He had no idea that Sarah Mitchell would become the most important person in his life, or that her simple act of compassion would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just his own future, but the futures of thousands of people around the world. All he knew was that he'd promised to live for one more day, and for the first time in a year, that felt like enough. Marcus Chun kept his promise to Sarah Mitchell, but the first few months were the hardest of his life. Each morning brought the same crushing weight of guilt and shame, the same mountain of seemingly impossible challenges. But each evening, he called Sarah as promised, and somehow found the strength to commit to one more day. The trial began in February 2020, just as Marcus was beginning to glimpse the possibility of a future beyond his current nightmare. His public defender, overwhelmed and under-resourced, had prepared a minimal defense. The prosecution painted Marcus as a reckless entrepreneur who'd prioritize profits over patient safety, rushing a dangerous product to market despite knowing about critical flaws. The testimony was devastating. Family members of the deceased patients spoke about their losses with raw emotion. Expert witnesses explained how the software failures had led directly to the fatal medication errors. Former Medicorp employees, many now struggling financially, testified about the pressure to launch despite unresolved issues. But something unexpected happened during the trial. Marcus's demeanor in court began to change. Instead of the broken, defeated man who'd stood on the Golden Gate Bridge 3 months earlier, he became engaged and focused. He took detailed notes during testimony, asked pointed questions during breaks, and began to see patterns in the failures that even the expert witnesses had missed. During a recess in the 3rd week of trial, Marcus approached the families of the patients who had died. Against his lawyer's advice, he spoke with them directly, accepting full responsibility for their losses and explaining in detail what had gone wrong with the software. He didn't make excuses or try to minimize his culpability. He simply acknowledged the harm he'd caused and expressed his genuine remorse. Maria Santos's daughter, whose grandmother had died from the blood thinner overdose, was initially hostile. But as Marcus explained the technical details of the failure, she began to understand that this wasn't simple negligence or greed. It was a complex system failure that resulted from poor decision-making under intense pressure. "My grandmother was a nurse for 40 years, she told Marcus. She always said that mistakes happen in medicine, but what matters is learning from them so they don't happen again. What are you learning from this?" That question haunted Marcus throughout the remainder of the trial. What was he learning? How could his catastrophic failure serve some larger purpose? The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a verdict of guilty on the negligence charges, but not guilty on the more serious manslaughter counts. The judge sentenced Marcus to 2 years in minimum security prison, with eligibility for work release after 8 months if he demonstrated good behavior and community service. Prison was not what Marcus had expected. The minimum security facility in Northern California housed mostly white-collar criminals, tax evaders, embezzlers, and other nonviolent offenders. Many were highly educated professionals who'd made catastrophic mistakes in their careers. Marcus's cellmate was Dr. Richard Hayes, a former pharmaceutical researcher who'd been convicted of falsifying clinical trial data. Unlike Marcus, Hayes showed no remorse for his actions, viewing his prosecution as a witch hunt by regulators who didn't understand the complexities of drug development. "The system is rigged against innovators," Hayes would say during their late-night conversations. "We take risks to advance human knowledge, and when something goes wrong, they crucify us. You should be angry, Chun, not guilty." But Marcus found that guilt, properly channeled, was more useful than anger. He spent his prison time reading everything he could find about medical error prevention, software safety protocols, and regulatory oversight in healthcare technology. The prison library was limited, but Sarah helped by sending him books and research papers she found through SF General's medical library. Sarah's letters became Marcus's lifeline during those 18 months in prison. She wrote to him twice a week, sharing updates about her work at the hospital and her daughter Emma's progress with managing her diabetes. More importantly, she continued to challenge Marcus to think beyond his own suffering and consider how his experience could benefit others. "Your failure teaches lessons that success never could," she wrote in one letter. "The question is whether you'll waste those lessons wallowing in self-pity or use them to prevent other tragedies." Through their correspondence, Marcus learned that Sarah's commitment to helping others extended far beyond her nursing duties. She volunteered at a free clinic for uninsured patients, mentored new nurses at SF General, and served on a hospital committee reviewing medical error cases. Her life was dedicated to service, and her example inspired Marcus to consider what his own life of service might look like. 8 months into his sentence, Marcus was approved for work release. The challenge was finding employment as a convicted felon with a notorious reputation in the tech industry. No mainstream technology company would consider hiring him, and his legal restrictions prevented him from starting another business or working in healthcare technology. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the chief medical officer at SF General, had been following Marcus's case through Sarah's updates. Dr. Walsh had spent her career studying medical errors and patient safety, and she recognized that Marcus's unique combination of technical expertise and personal experience with catastrophic failure could be valuable. "We need someone who understands both the technology and the consequences when it fails," she told Sarah. "Marcus Chun has made mistakes that most technologists never have to confront. That makes him uniquely qualified to help us prevent similar failures." Dr. Walsh arranged for Marcus to work as a consultant for SF General's Patient Safety Committee during his work release. His job was to review the hospital's technology systems and identify potential failure points that could lead to medical errors. The work was unpaid. Prison regulations prevented him from earning significant income, but it gave Marcus his first opportunity to use his skills in service of patient safety rather than profit. Working at SF General was initially uncomfortable for Marcus. Many staff members knew about his conviction and viewed him with suspicion. How could they trust someone who'd built software that killed patients to help improve their own systems? But Marcus's approach gradually won over skeptics. Instead of presenting himself as an expert, he approached each system review with humility and curiosity. He asked detailed questions about workflow patterns, listened carefully to concerns from nurses and doctors, and identified problems that less experienced consultants had missed. His first major discovery came within a month of starting at SF General. The hospital's medication dispensing system had a user interface design flaw that could cause nurses to select incorrect dosages when they were tired or working under stress. The flaw was subtle. It would only manifest under specific circumstances, but Marcus recognized it because it was similar to issues that had contributed to Medicorp's failure. Marcus presented his findings to the Patient Safety Committee with detailed documentation and suggested solutions. More importantly, he explained how similar interface problems had contributed to the deaths at Medicorp, giving the committee a visceral understanding of why seemingly minor design flaws could have catastrophic consequences. The committee implemented Marcus's recommendations immediately, and within 3 months, medication error rates in the hospital's intensive care unit dropped by 40%. Word of Marcus's work began to spread throughout SF General and then to other hospitals in the Bay Area. As his work release period continued, Marcus developed a new methodology for technology safety audits in healthcare settings. Instead of focusing only on technical specifications and compliance requirements, his approach emphasized understanding the human factors that contributed to system failures. How did stress affect user decision-making? What shortcuts did overworked staff take that could bypass safety protocols? How could interfaces be designed to prevent errors, even when users were exhausted or distracted? Marcus's methodology was revolutionary because it combined technical expertise with deep personal understanding of failure consequences. Most technology auditors had never seen their recommendations ignored, never experienced the guilt of knowing that their decisions had directly harmed people. Marcus had lived through that experience, and it informed every aspect of his work. When Marcus completed his prison sentence in August 2021, he faced a choice. He could return to his old life, trying to rebuild his reputation in the traditional tech industry, or he could continue the work he'd begun at SF General, using his experience to prevent medical errors and save lives. The decision was made easier by an unexpected phone call. Dr. Lisa Park, the chief medical officer at Seattle Children's Hospital, had heard about Marcus's work from Dr. Walsh. Seattle Children's was implementing a new electronic health record system and wanted Marcus to conduct a safety audit before going live. "We've heard that your approach to technology safety is different from anyone else's," Dr. Park told Marcus. "You understand not just what can go wrong, but what it feels like when things do go wrong. That perspective is exactly what we need." The Seattle Children's Project was Marcus's first paid consulting assignment since his release from prison. The fee was modest, $15,000 for a 3-week engagement, but it represented something more valuable than money. It was validation that his experience, as painful as it had been, could serve a meaningful purpose. Marcus's audit of Seattle Children's system identified 23 potential safety issues, ranging from minor interface problems to critical data integration flaws that could have led to serious medication errors. His recommendations were implemented before the system went live, and the hospital's first year with the new technology showed medication error rates 60% below the national average. Word of Marcus's success in Seattle spread quickly through the healthcare technology community. Hospital administrators began reaching out, seeking safety audits for their own systems. Medical device companies requested consultations on user interface design. Healthcare technology startups asked Marcus to review their products before submitting them for regulatory approval. By the end of 2021, Marcus had conducted safety audits for 12 hospitals and 3 medical device companies. His unique approach, combining technical analysis with deep understanding of failure consequences, was becoming the gold standard for healthcare technology safety review. But Marcus's growing success brought unexpected challenges. Media outlets began writing about his redemption story, portraying him as a villain who'd become a hero through suffering and hard work. While the coverage was generally positive, it made Marcus uncomfortable. He didn't want to be seen as someone who'd overcome his past. He wanted to be seen as someone whose past informed his present work in meaningful ways. More troubling was the interest from venture capital firms and technology companies who wanted to hire Marcus to build new healthcare technologies. They saw his reputation for safety as a competitive advantage and his story as compelling marketing material for investors and customers. "You could be worth hundreds of millions again," one venture capitalist told Marcus during a meeting in San Francisco. "Healthcare technology is exploding, and you're uniquely positioned to build the safest, most reliable systems in the industry. We could have you back on the cover of Forbes within 5 years." The offer was tempting, but Marcus had learned to be suspicious of his own ambitions. The same drive that had built Medicore into a billion-dollar company had also led to the decisions that destroyed it. Was he ready to handle that kind of pressure and responsibility again? Marcus discussed the decision with Sarah during one of their regular dinners. Their relationship had evolved during his imprisonment and recovery. She'd become his closest friend and most trusted advisor, the person who'd seen him at his lowest point and continued to believe in his capacity for growth and contribution. "What does your gut tell you?" Sarah asked. "Not your ego or your bank account, but your gut." "My gut tells me I'm not ready to build another company," Marcus admitted. "I'm still learning how to prevent failures. I don't think I'm ready to risk creating new ones." "Then, trust your gut," Sarah said simply. "The money will still be there in a few years if you decide you want it. But the opportunity to really master this work, to become the person who can prevent the next Medicore tragedy, that opportunity is here right now." Marcus declined the venture capital offer and continued his consulting work. But he also began thinking about a bigger vision for how his experience could serve others. Individual hospital audits were valuable, but they were reactive, addressing problems in existing systems rather than preventing them from being built in the first place. What if there was a way to systematically improve the safety of healthcare technology before it reached patients? What if Marcus could create a new kind of organization, one that combined technical expertise with lived experience of catastrophic failure to make all healthcare technology safer and more reliable? The idea that would define the next phase of Marcus's life was beginning to take shape. But first, he needed to understand whether other people who'd experienced similar failures might be willing to join him in this work. Were there other technologists who'd learned hard lessons about the consequences of their decisions and wanted to use that knowledge to serve others? The answer to that question would come from a most unexpected source: his former best friend David Kim, who'd been living on the streets of San Jose since Medicore's collapse. Marcus Chun was conducting a safety audit at Stanford Medical Center in March 2022 when he saw him. David Kim was pushing a shopping cart full of belongings across the hospital parking lot, his once pristine appearance now hidden beneath layers of worn clothing and months of street living. The brilliant engineer who had once commanded six-figure salaries and stock options was now clearly homeless, searching through trash bins for recyclables. The sight hit Marcus like a physical blow. Of all the people hurt by Medicore's collapse, David's fall had been the most personal and devastating to witness. David hadn't just lost money. He'd lost his family, his home, his identity, and apparently his hope. Marcus's first instinct was to approach David immediately, but he hesitated. Their last conversation, 18 months before Marcus's trial, had ended with David shouting that he never wanted to see Marcus again. David had blamed Marcus not just for the business failure, but for convincing him to leave Google, for encouraging other engineers to follow him, for creating the toxic culture of risk-taking that had led to the software flaws. "You destroyed all of us," David had said. "I had a good life, Marcus. I had a family, a house, financial security. I gave all of that up because I believed in you, and you threw it away for a few extra months of runway and some positive press coverage." The accusation had been devastating because it was largely true. Marcus had convinced David to leave his lucrative position at Google by painting a vision of revolutionizing healthcare technology together. When Medicore secured its series of funding, Marcus had personally recruited a dozen talented engineers from David's network, promising them equity stakes and the opportunity to build something meaningful. When the company collapsed, those engineers became unemployable in Silicon Valley. The Medicore scandal had tainted everyone associated with it. Hiring managers saw their resumes and immediately associated them with the medication errors that had killed patients. Even though the engineers weren't responsible for the business decisions that led to premature launch, their careers were effectively over. David had taken this failure harder than anyone. As Chief Technology Officer, he'd been the public face of Medicore's engineering team. His presentations at tech conferences had promoted the software's capabilities. His interviews with trade publications had assured healthcare administrators that the system was ready for deployment. When the software failures became public, David felt personally responsible for every life lost. The guilt consumed him completely. His wife, Sarah, ironically sharing a name with Marcus's guardian angel from the bridge, had tried to support him through the initial crisis, but David's depression deepened with each lawsuit filing and media story. He began drinking heavily, spending days in bed, and refusing to look for new employment. Sarah Kim pleaded with him to seek professional help, but David insisted that he deserved to suffer for his role in the tragedy. When their savings ran out and they lost their house, Sarah took their 2 young children to live with her parents in Portland. The divorce papers arrived 6 months later. Sarah had found work as a school administrator in Oregon and was building a new life for herself and the children. She couldn't wait any longer for David to recover from his guilt and depression. Without family or professional identity, David had simply disappeared into the shadow economy of homeless encampments and day labor jobs. Marcus had tried repeatedly to find him, hiring private investigators and reaching out through mutual contacts, but David had effectively vanished. Now, seeing David rummaging through hospital trash bins, Marcus realized how completely his friend's life had disintegrated. The David Kim he'd known had been obsessively clean and organized, proud of his appearance and professional reputation. This person looked like he hadn't showered in weeks and was wearing clothes that hadn't been washed in much longer. Marcus finished his consultation meeting quickly and waited in the parking lot until David emerged from behind the medical center's dumpsters. Taking a deep breath, Marcus approached slowly, trying not to startle him. "David," he called softly. David looked up, and Marcus was shocked by what he saw. His former best friend had lost at least 30 pounds. His face was gaunt and weathered, his eyes hollow and unfocused. But more disturbing was the lack of recognition in David's expression, as if he was looking through Marcus rather than at him. "David, it's me." "Marcus." This time, recognition flickered in David's eyes, followed immediately by anger. "What the hell are you doing here?" David's voice was hoarse and weak, but the rage was unmistakable. "I was working here, at the hospital. I saw you and—" "David, I've been looking for you for 2 years. Ever since I got out of prison, I've been trying to find you." "Prison?" David laughed bitterly. "Right, you got to pay your debt to society and start over. How nice for you. Meanwhile, I'm living in a tent under Highway 101, collecting cans to buy food. But I guess that's not your problem anymore, is it?" The pain in David's voice was devastating, but Marcus forced himself to stay calm. "It is my problem, David. Everything that happened to you is my responsibility, and I want to help make it right." "Make it right?" David's voice rose to a shout, attracting attention from hospital staff walking through the parking lot. "You want to make it right? Give me back my family. Give me back my career. Give me back the last 3 years of my life. Can you do that, Marcus? Can your guilt money fix any of that?" Marcus had rehearsed this conversation countless times in his head, but the reality was more painful than he'd imagined. David wasn't just angry. He was broken in ways that went beyond financial loss or career damage. This was someone who'd lost his fundamental sense of self-worth and purpose. "I can't give you back what you've lost," Marcus said quietly. "But I can offer you something else. A chance to use what you've learned, what we've both learned, to prevent other people from going through what we've been through." David stared at him with a mixture of confusion and contempt. What are you talking about? I'm working as a consultant now, helping hospitals and medical device companies improve their technology safety. The work I'm doing is preventing medical errors and saving lives. I need help, David. I need someone who understands the technical issues as well as the human consequences of failure. You want me to help you rebuild your reputation? David asked. Help you turn your prison sentence into a heartwarming redemption story? Forget it, Marcus. Find someone else to be your poster child for second chances. Marcus had expected this reaction, but it still stung. He pulled out his phone and showed David a photo from his recent work at Seattle Children's Hospital. This is the pediatric intensive care unit at Seattle Children's. The safety audit I did there prevented 17 potential medication errors in the first 6 months after implementation. That's 17 children who didn't get hurt because of the work I'm doing. David glanced at the photo but didn't respond. I'm not trying to rebuild my reputation, David. I'm trying to use what I learned from our failure to prevent other failures. The methodology I've developed combines technical analysis with understanding of how stress and fatigue affect decision-making. But I need someone who understands the engineering side better than I do. I need someone who's lived through the consequences of getting it wrong. Why would you want my help? David asked, his voice quieter now. I'm the one who approved the code that killed those patients. I'm the one who told you the system was ready for deployment when it wasn't. You're also the one who identified most of the vulnerabilities before launch, Marcus replied. You wrote detailed reports about the risks, recommended additional testing, suggested interface improvements that would have prevented the errors. The business pressure to launch overrode your technical judgment, but your technical judgment was sound. For the first time since recognizing Marcus, David looked directly at him instead of through him. You read my old reports? I've read everything from Medicore's files dozens of times. Your analysis of the user interface problems was brilliant, David. If we'd listened to your recommendations, those patients would still be alive today. David was quiet for several minutes, processing this information. Marcus waited, hoping that somewhere beneath the anger and despair, his friend's intellectual curiosity and desire to help people might still exist. What kind of work are you talking about? David finally asked. Marcus spent the next hour explaining his consulting practice, the safety audits he conducted, and the methodology he developed for identifying failure points in healthcare technology. He showed David case studies from his work at various hospitals, explaining how technical analysis combined with understanding of human factors could prevent catastrophic errors. The thing is, Marcus said, I'm good identifying problems and understanding consequences, but I'm not as good at developing technical solutions as I used to be. My coding skills have atrophied, and I don't stay current with new development frameworks the way I should. I need someone who can bridge the gap between identifying problems and implementing fixes. David listened carefully, asking technical questions that demonstrated his expertise despite years away from professional software development. Even living on the streets, he maintained his intellectual curiosity about technology, using public library computers to stay current with industry developments. Where would I live? David asked. I don't have a home, Marcus. I don't have clean clothes or a way to shower regularly. I can't exactly show up to hospital consultations looking like this. I have an apartment in San Francisco, Marcus said. It has a second bedroom that's just sitting empty. You could stay there while you get back on your feet. And the consulting work pays well enough to support both of us comfortably. Why? David asked. Why are you offering this? Guilt. Marcus considered the question carefully. Partly guilt, yes, but mostly because I think together we could do something important. Separately, we're just two guys who failed spectacularly and are trying to rebuild our lives. Together, we could become the team that prevents other spectacular failures. What if I'm not ready for this? David asked. What if I'm too damaged to be useful? I haven't worked on a development team in 3 years, Marcus. I've been living in a tent and collecting cans. I might not be the person you remember. Then, we'll figure out together, Marcus said. Day by day, project by project. The same way I figured out how to survive prison, the same way I figured out how to rebuild after losing everything. Neither of us has to be perfect, David. We just have to be committed to doing better than we did before. David looked around the hospital parking lot, at the shopping cart full of his belongings, at the life he'd been living for the past 3 years. Then, he looked back at Marcus. "If I do this, I have conditions," David said. "First, I want to understand every aspect of your methodology. I'm not just implementing your ideas. I want to contribute to developing them. Second, when we prevent errors or save lives, the credit gets shared equally. I'm not going to be your anonymous assistant while you rebuild your public reputation." "Agreed," Marcus said immediately. "Third, I want to try to reconnect with my kids. I haven't spoken to them in 2 years because I was too ashamed of what I'd become. If this work helps me become someone they could be proud of again, I want your support in rebuilding that relationship." "Of course," Marcus said. "Whatever you need." David nodded slowly. "Then let's go. I need a shower and some clean clothes before I can even think about working on technology safety." As they walked toward Marcus's car, David pushing his shopping cart full of possessions, Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that David was alive and willing to try rebuilding his life. Guilt over the depth of his friend's suffering. Hope that together they might accomplish something meaningful. But the dominant emotion was gratitude. Gratitude to Sarah Mitchell, whose kiss on the Golden Gate Bridge had started this entire journey. Gratitude for the second chance he'd been given to use his skills in service of others. And now, gratitude for the possibility that David Kim might join him in turning their shared failure into a force for preventing future tragedies. Neither man could have imagined that their reunion in a hospital parking lot would lead to the creation of the most influential patient safety organization in the world. They were just two broken people trying to rebuild their lives and find meaning in their suffering. But sometimes the most important work begins with the humblest intentions. Sometimes saving the world starts with saving each other. 3 years later, on December 15th, 2025, exactly 6 years after Marcus Chun had stood on the Golden Gate Bridge contemplating suicide, he found himself standing in the same spot with a very different purpose. This time, he wasn't alone. David Kim stood beside him, along with Sarah Mitchell and 12 other people whose lives had been transformed by the organization they'd built together. The Safety First Foundation had become the most respected patient safety consultancy in North America, conducting over 200 technology audits annually and preventing an estimated 3,000 medical errors each year. But the statistics, impressive as they were, weren't what brought them to the bridge that December evening. They were there to commemorate the 6th anniversary of what Sarah had started calling the kiss that changed everything, and to celebrate the announcement of something that would extend their impact globally: the establishment of the Marcus Chun Institute for Healthcare Technology Safety, a $500 million research center that would train the next generation of safety-focused technologists. The funding for the institute had come from an unexpected source: Rebecca Santos. Marcus's former fiancée, who had abandoned him during his darkest hour, had become a successful venture capitalist specializing in healthcare technology investments. She'd built a portfolio worth over $2 billion and had watched from a distance as Marcus transformed himself from a convicted felon into the world's leading expert on preventing technology-related medical errors. Rebecca had reached out to Marcus 6 months earlier with a proposal that stunned him. She wanted to fund the institute as both an investment in patient safety and as her own form of making amends for abandoning him when he needed support most. "I chose my career over loyalty," she'd told Marcus during their first conversation in 6 years. "I was protecting my reputation while you were rebuilding your soul. The person I am now was partly shaped by watching what you became after I left. I want to invest in that transformation." The Marcus Chun Institute would be based at Stanford University, training engineers, developers, and healthcare professionals in the methodology that Marcus and David had refined over hundreds of consulting projects. Students would learn not just technical skills, but the human factors that contributed to system failures and the psychological impact of being responsible for others' safety. But the Institute represented more than just Marcus's personal redemption. It embodied a new philosophy about how technology should be developed and deployed in high-stakes environments. Instead of the Silicon Valley mantra of move fast and break things, the Institute would teach move carefully and save lives. The methodology that Marcus and David had developed, now known as the Chun-Kim Protocol, had become the gold standard for healthcare technology safety assessment. The protocol required technologists to spend time in clinical environments, observing how their systems would actually be used by stressed, overworked healthcare professionals. It mandated that safety audits be conducted by teams that included people who had personally experienced the consequences of technology failures. Most importantly, the protocol required that every healthcare technology company employ at least one failure expert, someone whose previous mistakes had taught them to recognize potential problems that others might miss. This last requirement had created unexpected career opportunities for dozens of technologists whose reputations had been damaged by high-profile failures. Instead of being unemployable because of their mistakes, they became highly sought after for their hard-won expertise. David Kim had become the most prominent example of this transformation. After 18 months of working with Marcus to rebuild his technical skills and emotional stability, David had emerged as a leading voice in the patient safety community. His presentations at medical conferences drew standing ovations, and his research on user interface design for high-stress environments had been adopted by medical device companies worldwide. More personally meaningful to David, he had slowly rebuilt relationships with his children. His ex-wife Sarah had initially been skeptical of his transformation, but she gradually came to see that David's work with Safety First had given him a sense of purpose that he'd never found in traditional software development. He's not the same person who fell apart after Medicore, Sarah Kim told a journalist writing about David's recovery. That person was brilliant, but fragile. This person is brilliant and strong because he's found work that matters more than his ego or his bank account. David's children, now teenagers, had begun spending summers with him in San Francisco. They were proud to tell their friends that their father's work prevented people from getting hurt in hospitals, that his mistakes had taught him how to help others avoid similar problems. The Safety First Foundation had grown far beyond Marcus and David's original partnership. The organization now employed 37 consultants, researchers, and support staff, many of whom had their own stories of professional failure and personal redemption. Dr. Linda Chun, a former FDA regulator who had approved a medical device that later proved dangerous, led Safety First's Regulatory Compliance Division. James Wright, a software engineer whose code had contributed to a hospital data breach that exposed thousands of patient records, directed the Foundation's cybersecurity initiatives. Maria Santos, a hospital administrator whose cost-cutting measures had led to staffing shortages and medication errors, managed Safety First organizational safety programs. Each of these professionals had found in Safety First not just employment, but a way to transform their worst mistakes into their most valuable contributions. They formed what Marcus called the Fellowship of the Failed, people who understood viscerally that the stakes of their work extended far beyond paychecks and performance reviews. Sarah Mitchell had played a crucial role in Safety First development, though she never officially joined the organization. She remained a trauma nurse at SF General, but she served on Safety First board and helped design the psychological support systems for both consultants and the healthcare workers they served. Sarah's insight had been that preventing technology failures required addressing not just technical problems, but the human factors that contributed to errors: fatigue, stress, emotional overwhelm, and the psychological pressure to take shortcuts when systems didn't work as designed. Tired people make mistakes, Sarah would say in her board presentations. Stressed people make mistakes. Overwhelmed people make mistakes. If your technology doesn't account for human limitations, it's not really safe, no matter how elegant the code is. This philosophy had led Safety First to develop training programs for healthcare workers as well as technology audits. The organization taught nurses, doctors, and pharmacists to recognize when they were at higher risk for errors due to fatigue or stress, and provided tools for managing those risks. The training programs had proven as valuable as the technology audits. Hospitals that implemented both safety-first technical recommendations and their human factors training saw medical error rates drop by an average of 65%, far better results than either intervention achieved alone. As the group stood on the Golden Gate Bridge that December evening, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them there. The organization he and David had built was preventing thousands of medical errors annually and training hundreds of healthcare professionals to work more safely. The institute that would bear his name would extend this impact to future generations of technologists. But the most profound change was personal. Marcus had discovered that his greatest failure had prepared him for his most important work. The guilt and shame that had nearly destroyed him had become sources of empathy and wisdom that made him uniquely qualified to help others navigate similar challenges. David's transformation had been even more dramatic. From a homeless man collecting cans for food, he became a respected researcher and consultant whose work was improving patient safety worldwide. His children now introduced him proudly as someone who used his mistakes to help save lives. Sarah Mitchell had never asked for recognition or reward for her intervention on the bridge that night in 2019. She'd simply seen someone in crisis and refused to let him face it alone. But her act of compassion had created ripple effects that now touch thousands of lives annually. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't walked across this bridge that night? Marcus asked Sarah as they looked out at the dark water below. I think about it all the time, Sarah replied, but not in a self-congratulatory way. I think about it because it reminds me that we never know when our small actions might have enormous consequences. Every day at the hospital, I try to remember that a moment of kindness, a willingness to listen, a decision to help instead of walking away, these things can literally change the world. David nodded. That night when you found me in the parking lot, Marcus, I was convinced my life was over. I thought the only purpose I could serve was as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition and risk-taking. I never imagined that my failure could become the foundation for meaningful work. Maybe that's the real lesson, Marcus said. Not that failure is good or that suffering makes us stronger, but that even our worst mistakes can be transformed into something useful if we're willing to do the work of transformation. As the group prepared to leave the bridge, Marcus pulled out his phone and called a number he'd dialed thousands of times over the past 6 years. "Hi, Mom," he said when his mother answered. "I'm calling from the Golden Gate Bridge. I wanted you to know that the Institute funding came through. The Marcus Chun Institute for Healthcare Technology Safety will be announcing its launch next month." His mother's voice was thick with emotion as she responded. "Your father and I are so proud of you, Marcus. Not for the money or the recognition, but for the person you've become, for the way you've turned your pain into purpose." The relationship with his parents had been the longest to heal. The shame of his conviction and the loss of their family home had created wounds that took years to address. But gradually, as Marcus's work gained recognition and respect, his parents had begun to see their son not as the source of family disgrace, but as someone who'd found a way to serve others despite his failures. His sister Lisa had been even more challenging. She lost not just her pension fund, but her teaching career and her trust in family relationships. It had taken 3 years of patient outreach, including Marcus paying for her retraining as a nurse practitioner before she'd been willing to speak with him again. Now Lisa worked as a consultant for Safety First, using her experience with both education and healthcare to develop training programs for medical staff. Her classroom skills had proven invaluable in teaching complex safety concepts to busy healthcare professionals. "The irony isn't lost on me," Lisa had told Marcus during one of their recent conversations. "You destroyed my first career, but you also made my second career possible. I'm helping save lives because you taught me, in the most painful way possible, how much damage good intentions can cause when they're not balanced by careful thinking." As the group walked back toward San Francisco, Marcus thought about the speech he would give at the Institute's launch event. He'd been asked to speak about resilience, redemption, and second chances. But Marcus had come to believe that his story wasn't really about any of those things. Instead, he wanted to talk about responsibility, not just the responsibility to avoid causing harm, but the responsibility to transform harm into healing when prevention fails. He wanted to challenge the audience to think about failure not as something to be hidden or overcome, but as a source of knowledge that could serve others. Most importantly, he wanted to honor the people whose lives have been changed by his mistakes and his response to them. The patients who died because of Medicorp's failures deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as teachers whose deaths had led to innovations that were now saving other lives. The families who'd lost loved ones to medication errors deserved recognition for their grace in working with Marcus and Safety First to prevent similar tragedies. Their willingness to engage with the person responsible for their loss had been a form of forgiveness that Marcus was still learning to accept. Sarah Mitchell deserved acknowledgement not just for her intervention on the bridge, but for her ongoing wisdom and guidance throughout Safety First development. Her nursing expertise and her understanding of human nature had been as crucial to the organization's success as any technical innovation. And David Kim deserves celebration for his courage in choosing recovery over despair, for his willingness to transform his suffering into service, and for his commitment to using his technical brilliance in support of human welfare rather than personal advancement. 6 years after that December night on the Golden Gate Bridge, Marcus Chin had learned that the most important kiss of his life hadn't been romantic or passionate. It had been a blessing from a stranger who'd refused to let him die alone, a gesture of grace that had opened the possibility of transformation. The Safety First Foundation and the Marcus Chin Institute would eventually prevent tens of thousands of medical errors and save countless lives. The Chin Kim protocol would become standard practice throughout the healthcare technology industry. The Fellowship of the Failed would inspire a new generation of technologists to prioritize safety over speed, service over profit. But none of those achievements would have been possible without Sarah Mitchell's decision to stop walking and start caring about a broken stranger on a bridge. As Marcus drove home that evening, he realized that the most extraordinary outcomes often began with the most ordinary acts of human kindness. Sarah hadn't set out to save a billionaire or launch a patient safety revolution. She'd simply seen someone in crisis and refused to let him face it alone. That simple decision, to stay instead of walking away, to care instead of remaining indifferent, to offer hope instead of accepting despair, had created ripple effects that were still expanding across the healthcare industry and around the world. Marcus pulled into his driveway and sat in his car for a moment, thinking about the speech he would give at the Institute launch. He knew exactly how he wanted to begin it. 6 years ago, I was saved by a kiss from a stranger. Not a romantic kiss, but something more powerful, a kiss of hope delivered by someone who chose compassion over convenience, service over self-protection. That kiss didn't just save my life. It set in motion a chain of events that has saved thousands of other lives and will continue to save lives for generations to come. The woman who gave me that kiss was a nurse named Sarah Mitchell. She was walking home from a 14-hour shift at SF General Hospital when she found me contemplating suicide on the Golden Gate Bridge. She had every reason to keep walking. She was exhausted, she didn't know me, and she had her own problems to deal with. But she stopped anyway. She listened, she cared, and she refused to let me die alone. Sarah's decision that night teaches us something profound about the power of individual actions to create systemic change. One person's choice to help a stranger in crisis led to the creation of an organization that now prevents thousands of medical errors annually. One moment of human connection sparked innovations that are making healthcare safer for patients around the world. This is the story I want to share with you tonight. Not just about second chances or redemption, but about the extraordinary power of ordinary kindness to change everything. Marcus smiled, knowing that Sarah would probably be embarrassed by the attention, but would understand why her story needed to be told. Her kiss had indeed saved a billionaire, but the real miracle was what happened next. How that salvation had multiplied exponentially, creating safety and healing for thousands of people she would never meet. In the end, That was the true legacy of that December night on the Golden Gate Bridge. Not just one life saved, but countless lives made safer by the chain reaction of compassion that followed. Sarah Mitchell's simple act of refusing to walk away had become a force that would ripple through the healthcare system for decades to come, preventing tragedies and saving lives in ways that no one could have predicted. The kiss that saved a billionaire had become the kiss that saved thousands.